The moment my aunt leaned into me at my father's grave and whispered, "Sign this, or I will make sure you lose every single thing your father ever touched," I knew she hadn't come to mourn. She had come to take. The dirt over his coffin was still loose, still bright with fresh soil, and Meredith shoved a folder so close to my face I could smell the printer ink. She did it in front of everyone, in front of my mother, who looked away, in front of cousins, pretending they didn't hear. "Your dad chose the wrong child," she said loud enough for the pastor who was walking to his car to turn back. "But thank God I can still fix his biggest mistake." Someone behind her muttered, "26 and still nothing to show for it." Another person chuckled like it was a joke. Meredith smiled like she agreed. "Be thankful, Arya. I am trying to save you from yourself. We all know you were never meant to handle real responsibility, especially land worth this much." She tapped the folder with one long, manicured finger. $5 million, sweetheart, $5 million. If you cared about your father even a little, you would not hesitate. Then she tilted her head at me with a look I had seen her use on stray animals outside her store, pity mixed with disgust. "Honestly, your father worried himself sick over you. Stress will do terrible things to a man's heart. If you had made better choices, maybe he would still be here." There it was, the blow she wanted to land. A few relatives gasped quietly, but no one said a word. They just watched me like they were waiting to see if I would break. Meredith leaned in again. "You think you are strong enough to hold land like that? You think you can pay the taxes, handle the paperwork. You cannot even handle your own life. Either sign now or watch the county take everything. And when that happens, do not come crying to me, because I will not lift a finger to help you." I closed the folder slowly and handed it back. "I am not signing." Her smile dropped so fast it looked like it hurt. Her voice became a cold whisper. "Then you will regret it. I know things you don't. Things your father hid from you. You think you are ready for that." While everyone stared at me like I was the problem, my phone buzzed quietly in my pocket. A single line flashed across the screen. "Verification complete. High security access restored." No one noticed. No one cared. They saw me as the girl with nothing. It was easier to let them believe it. For now. I slid my hand into my pocket and touched the small brass key hidden in my wallet, the one the banker placed in my hand 2 days after my father died, with an envelope marked in his handwriting, "Not yet. Wait until they show their true faces." I had thought it was just my father being dramatic. But now, watching Meredith clutch that folder like it was already hers, watching my own mother take a step toward her, instead of me watching relatives whisper and nod, like they all agreed I was unworthy, I understood. This was the moment he meant. Meredith snapped the folder shut and said, "Walk away if you want, but remember, when everything collapses, it will be because of your pride." I looked at the grave, at the soil that still held the shape of the shovel, and then at her face. Calm, calculated, certain she had already won. She had no idea what my father had prepared. She had no idea what I was capable of. "We will see," I said softly. Her eyebrow lifted like she did not believe me, like she did not even consider me a threat. Good. Let her stay blind. That would make what came next much easier. I left the cemetery with the chill of my aunt's voice still sitting in my chest, and as I drove back toward Flagstaff, the sky over the San Francisco peaks looked heavy with late afternoon clouds, and the pine line along the highway blurred through the windshield, the familiar stretch of road doing nothing to settle the tightness in my throat, because I knew that once I pulled into the neighborhood where my father raised me, where the houses sat between tall ponderosa pines, and the air always smelled faintly of sap and dust, I would be walking straight back into a family that had never truly seen me, not when I was 18 and moved out on my own, not when I found my first job, not even when my father proudly told them I was working with land maps and analysis work they still called pointless, even after he spent years explaining why it mattered, why it was shaping development and zoning in half the county. I parked in front of the house, stepped out into the dry autumn air, and saw my cousins gathered on the porch, whispering in the way people do when they want you to hear pieces, but not the whole thing. And as I walked up the steps, my cousin Lila gave me a smile that was almost real until her gaze slid down to my plain shoes and the wrinkle in my coat sleeve. And she said, "You should really iron that aria today of all days," which only made the knot in my chest pull a little tighter, because it was the same tone she had used for years, the one that said she was older by 8 months, and somehow that meant she had the right to judge my entire existence. Inside the living room, the family had already rearranged themselves into a loose circle, talking in low voices, and when I stepped in, they all paused as if I had interrupted something important, although none of them spoke directly to me until Meredith herself turned from the kitchen doorway and gave me that smile, the one that never reached her eyes, the one she used when she had already decided how the conversation would end and wanted to enjoy the path getting there. She gestured at me with her cup of tea and said to everyone, "See, this is what I mean. She always looks like she is running from somewhere, never toward anything." And for a moment, my jaw locked because it sounded exactly like the things she used to say when I was a teenager, back when she told my father I would never make it through community college, back when she said I would end up drifting a girl with no direction and no value. My Uncle Bruce, who had not done a day of physical labor in 20 years, leaned back in his chair and said in a voice loud enough for me to hear, "She works with maps, write pictures of dirt on computers. How does that even pay?" And another cousin snickered as if he had just said something clever. I stood there with my coat still on and wanted to tell them that being a junior GIS analyst meant I spent my days managing layers of zoning data and environmental impact reports, and that half the projects they praised developers for bragging about were built only because people like me mapped everything correctly. But instead, I kept my voice even and said, "It pays fine. I am good at what I do," which only made Meredith laugh softly as she set her cup down and moved closer. She touched my arm with the kind of gesture that pretends to be gentle but carries nothing soft behind it, and she said, "Honey, you look at maps all day. You do not look at real life. If your father had left that land to a real earner in this family, we would not be dealing with this mess now and listening to her speak about my father as if she had the right to rewrite his choices, sent heat up my neck. But before I could speak, she added the line that made my fingers curl into fists. If we let her keep $5 million worth of property, it would be like letting a dog guard a bank. Someone exhaled sharply, as if trying not to laugh, and my mother, who had been sitting on the couch with her hands folded neatly in her lap, only pressed her lips together as if she agreed, but did not want to say it out loud. I felt something inside me pull like a thread being yanked, something small but important, and I reminded myself that these people had never understood my work or my path, and that I had been on my own since I turned 18, paying rent, working 2 jobs, buying groceries without calling anyone for help, learning how to stand on my own legs without leaning on the family name. But none of that mattered now, because to them I was still the girl who drew maps in school, the one who never bragged, the one who never asked for more, the quiet one. And quiet to them meant weak. I stepped farther into the room and let their words move around me without letting them settle, trying to keep my father's last message steady in my mind, the note that still rested in my wallet like a small shield. But then my phone buzzed again, and habit made me glance down at the screen, even though I knew no one here would care if I seemed distracted. The email subject line read, "Board approval confirmed," and for a moment my heart gave a small jump, because even though I had applied months ago for a low-tier advisory position at a regional conservation group, a position no one in this room even knew existed, I had not expected to hear back this soon, and certainly not today. I opened the message while everyone continued whispering about me and about money, and about how my father had been too generous with his naive faith in me, And when I read the words, "We look forward to welcoming you to the board," and saw the digital signature at the bottom from a director whose name carried weight in land conservation circles across northern Arizona, something inside me steadied, not because I planned to tell anyone, but because it reminded me that their version of me was not the truth. I slipped my phone back into my pocket, and when I looked up, Meredith was watching with an expression that said she thought she had caught me hiding something trivial, maybe a text from someone unimportant, and she said in a voice dripping with sugar, "See, she is always somewhere else, never here with the family. How can she manage land when she cannot even manage to pay attention?" My mother gave a small nod, and my cousins followed as if the gesture were a cue, and in that moment I understood exactly why my father had written that note, why he told me to wait until they showed their true faces, because this was who they were, people who saw only what suited them and judged anything they could not understand. And standing in that living room surrounded by familiar walls and familiar voices that twisted every accomplishment into failure, I knew I was not dealing with a misunderstanding, but a pattern, one they had been reinforcing for years, one that my father had noticed even if he never said it out loud. I took a breath and met Meredith's stare without flinching. And although no one else noticed the shift, I felt it move through me like a quiet line being drawn, the beginning of something they would not see coming, something that would make their certainty crack. And for the first time that day, I felt a thin thread of calm settle across my shoulders. Not because they believed in me, but because their disbelief no longer mattered, because the truth my father left behind was waiting, and I was done pretending I did not see what they truly were. The next afternoon, the house felt heavier than usual as I walked toward the dining room, where Meredith had summoned everyone for what she called a family meeting about the land. And although the sky outside Flagstaff was bright with late autumn sun, the inside felt dim in that way homes do, when tension makes the air thick. And as I stepped through the doorway, I could tell right away this was not a discussion. It was a performance one. She had choreographed down to the last detail because she stood at the head of the room beside a small projector she had set up on the sideboard, her fingers resting on the remote, like she had been waiting her whole life for a stage. Chairs had been arranged in rows instead of a circle. Cousins and aunts and uncles crammed together with plates of leftover funeral sandwiches in their laps. And when I appeared, several heads turned with the kind of polite stiffness that hides judgment, the kind that says they had already decided what this meeting was about long before I arrived. Meredith gestured for me to sit in the front row where a single empty chair waited positioned so everyone could stare directly at me while she spoke. And when I hesitated for half a second, she narrowed her eyes in a silent warning that made heat creep up my neck, so I sat down and pressed my palms into my thighs, grounding myself as she clicked the projector on and filled the wall with the first slide. It was a large aerial image of the land, the 40 acres my father had poured his heart into for decades. But instead of honoring his work, she had circled it in red with the words, "High-risk property," typed across the top. And before I could even process that, she cleared her throat and said in a voice dripping with authority, she had never earned this. "Right here is the issue our family is facing. This land has become a liability because of a lack of proper management." A murmur passed through the room, the kind that grows when people want to seem informed even when they are not, and she clicked to the next slide, which showed a list of expenses associated with the land property, tax maintenance costs, legal fees, but the numbers were exaggerated, inflated to make it seem like the land was a sinking ship, and she was the only one willing to save it. And as she talked, she did not look at the screen or at the family. She looked only at me as if everything on the wall was an accusation pinned directly to my chest. She said this is what happens when someone without the proper experience is left in charge, and then she added, she has no understanding of zoning laws or management practices, and the room shifted slightly toward her view, because they trusted her confidence more than my quiet. I kept my breath steady as she turned to face the family fully and declared she is the reason the land is at risk. She is the reason we are even having this discussion," and several heads nodded in agreement, even though none of them had asked me a single question or listened to a single fact about the land or my work or anything my father might have told them. Her voice carried that cruel edge I recognized too well, the one she used when she wanted to ensure a wound would sting long after her words faded, and she said she contributes nothing. She has no financial stake. She has no experience. She has no maturity for this responsibility. Nothing about her life suggests she can handle an asset this large. And when she said that last line, I felt something inside me go still, not broken, not wounded, but quietly focused, because every insult she threw only confirmed what my father had warned me about. I kept my face calm as she moved to the next slide, which showed an image of me from a family barbecue 3 years ago, holding a paper plate and laughing at something out of frame. And under it, she had typed the caption, "Not ready," as if that single moment defined my competence, and the room reacted with soft sighs and sympathetic nods directed not at me, but at her narrative, the one she had built on selective memories and old judgments. I reached into my coat pocket and, without drawing attention, lifted my phone and opened the voice recorder, letting it capture every word she said because I knew each one would matter later, and the soft red dot on my screen glowed like a quiet kind of power. Meredith did not notice she was too consumed by her own script, and now she clicked to another slide that displayed a scanned document, a transfer of ownership form with my name typed in the signature line, and she smiled triumphantly as she said, "I tried to guide her. I tried to help her sign this before things got out of hand, but she refused, and now we are at risk of losing everything." The room went silent, the kind of silence where people do not speak because they are waiting for someone else to form their opinion for them. And then a cousin whispered, "I cannot believe she would refuse to protect the land." And an uncle said, "I always knew she was stubborn like that." And someone else added, "This is why young people should not be trusted with responsibility." My pulse thudded in my ears as I stared at the document she was showing because I recognized immediately the signature line was a forgery. The font identical to the one she used at her office, the margin spaces too perfect, the timestamp suspiciously recent, and in that moment I realized she did not just want control, she was willing to falsify paperwork to get it. Meredith pointed the remote at the slide like a judge presenting evidence and said, "This is what irresponsibility looks like. This is why we need to resolve this now and transfer the property to someone who will protect the family from financial disaster." And she let her gaze sweep the room with satisfaction because she thought she had already convinced them. I kept my breathing slow, kept my shoulders relaxed, kept my face still because reacting would only feed her performance. And when she paused to sip her tea, I raised my eyes to meet hers, holding her stare without blinking, letting her see none of the fear or anger she wanted so badly to draw out of me. In that stillness, I felt the note in my wallet like a steady pulse, the brass key like a weight meant to ground me. And though they all saw a young woman sitting silently in a room full of critics, I knew something they did not. I knew the truth. My father left behind. I knew the manipulation unfolding in front of me would unravel. And as I tightened my grip on my phone with the recording still running, I felt that same quiet line draw itself across my mind like it had the night before the start of a storm they did not know was coming. I woke the next morning with that same steady awareness under my skin, the kind that comes when you know someone is plotting something behind a closed door. And as I brewed a cup of coffee in my small Flagstaff apartment, my phone vibrated with a number I recognized instantly. It was from the front desk at my office, and the tone in the receptionist's voice was tight as she said, "Aria HR needs you to come in for an immediate review." And even though I kept my breathing calm, I felt that faint pulse behind my ribs because I knew immediately whose hands were behind this. I drove through the pine-lined streets toward the firm, the mountain air crisp enough to sting my face. And when I parked and walked inside, the fluorescent lights felt harsher than usual, as if they were trying to expose something. And as soon as I stepped into the HR conference room, I saw my manager sitting stiffly beside a file folder that was much too thin to warrant a meeting this urgent, which meant the content was not the point the accusation was. The HR rep folded her hands and asked in a careful voice if I was aware of a report that had come in that morning accusing me of attempting to manipulate property zoning information regarding the land my father had left. And the moment I heard those words, I felt the last lingering illusion fall away because the phrasing was too specific, too strategic, too familiar with my field to come from anyone other than Meredith. I kept my expression neutral as I answered calmly that the accusation was false and that I had never used company resources for personal land affairs, but I could see my manager's jaw twitch with discomfort as he said, "Family issues will destroy your career if you let them seep into your work," and the pitying tone in his voice almost made me laugh because it mirrored the same tone Meredith used when she pretended to worry about me while sharpening the knife behind my back. I leaned forward just enough to look sincere and said, "I understand why you are concerned, and I appreciate the company taking allegations seriously. But I can assure you, this is a personal matter being weaponized by a relative with an agenda." And when the HR rep asked if I had proof, I simply nodded and said, "Documentation is in progress," which was the truth, because the recording on my phone and the forged document on her projector would soon become exactly that. My manager exhaled as if relieved to hear firmness in my voice, though he still added a gentle warning that even the perception of impropriety could harm my future advancement, and I gave a small nod while offering a short, polite smile, because a moment like that required a diplomatic mask rather than a defensive flair, and I could sense the shift in the room as they realized I was not the unstable young woman Meredith had painted in her report, but someone who understood the seriousness of professional reputation and who was not easily rattled. When the meeting adjourned, I thanked them both, walked out with steady steps, and only once I reached the parking lot did I let out a slow breath, not of fear, but of confirmation that Meredith was escalating faster than I expected. I sat in the driver's seat and checked my phone, seeing several missed messages from cousins asking what I had done this time, and one even said, "I heard you are being reviewed at work for tax evasion on the land," and I stared at the screen in disbelief at how quickly lies spread when they suited someone's narrative, and soon after another text arrived from an aunt saying, "Meredith told us you are trying to hide tax debts and could lose everything if you refuse to cooperate." And I felt that familiar heat rise under my collar, not from embarrassment, but from the sharp clarity that comes when you finally see the shape of an opponent's strategy. Instead of reacting, I opened the email app to clear a notification and then froze when I saw a subject line that read, "Board approval confirmed." And for a moment, the chaos around me blurred, because that message was a quiet reminder of the truth. No one in my family knew a truth that made their ridicule almost laughable, a truth that had nothing to do with the land and everything to do with my own life outside their narrow expectations. I did not open the email yet, instead, letting it sit at the top of the screen, like a hidden blade waiting for the right moment. And then I started the car and drove toward my father's land because I needed distance from the noise of town. The appraising glances, the whispers spreading faster than wildfire, and as I walked through the pine needles and dry earth, I felt the weight of everything she was trying to strip from me. Not just the property, but the right to my own name, my own competence, my own future. I thought about the PowerPoint she displayed, the forged document, the smug certainty in her voice when she told the family I was dragging them toward disaster, and I realized her campaign was more calculated than I had assumed. She wanted to discredit me so thoroughly that when she tried to take the land, people would side with her without question. I crouched beside a low ridge overlooking one corner of the property, and the cold wind brushed across my face as I whispered to myself that she had no idea who she was dealing with. She thought this was still the girl who used to do extra shifts at the grocery store at 18 to pay her rent, not the woman who had quietly built a role in a field she barely understood, not the woman who kept detailed maps of every zoning law and environmental study in Coconino County, not the woman holding a brass key to a vault she had no clue existed. I reached into my jacket to touch the note my father left me, as if drawing strength from the ink he pressed into the page, and then I stood and turned back toward town, because the more she pushed, the more she revealed her own desperation, and I knew that every step she took to hurt me only added another layer of evidence I could use later. By the time I reached home, the sun had dipped low, and my phone buzzed again with new messages, all repeating some version of the same lie whispers about tax fraud and irresponsible handling, and I realized Meredith had mobilized the entire extended family to spread her narrative, because the louder the noise, the easier it was for her to justify stealing something that was never hers. I set the phone down, exhaled slowly, and allowed a small, quiet smile to pull at the corner of my mouth, because she was building her own downfall with every lie she spoke, and all I needed to do was let her keep talking. I drove to my father's house that evening with a heaviness in my chest that felt different from grief, something slower and colder, something that came from the sharp clarity I felt after the meeting with the developer, and after realizing how far Meredith was willing to go to paint me as incompetent, and as the sun dipped behind the ponderosa pines and cast long shadows across the gravel driveway. The house looked exactly the same as when he was alive, yet entirely different, because now every corner felt like it was holding a secret. He never had time to tell me, so I unlocked the front door and stepped inside, inhaling the faint smell of cedar and old books. And for a moment, I stood there, letting the air settle around me before moving through the quiet rooms toward the study. He used to keep locked even from my mother. The brass key I had found in my wallet weighed like a small truth in my pocket, and when I used it on the desk drawer, the click echoed in the silence, and I followed the direction he had written in his note 3 steps from the window and 1 tile over. And when I knelt and pushed, there was a slight shift like a latch, revealing a concealed metal safe embedded in the floor, one I never knew existed even after years of visiting. My breath caught, but I forced myself to stay calm as I inserted the key into the small square lock and felt the tumblers turn, and when I lifted the lid, the faint scent of paper and dust rose from inside, along with the cold gleam of a USB drive and a stack of envelopes bound with twine, and on top of everything rested a letter in my father's handwriting, not sealed, not finished, like he had been interrupted while writing it. My fingers shook slightly as I reached for it, noticing the uneven strokes in the last lines where his hand must have trembled, and the words read, "I need you to understand something before anyone else does," and then below that the ink trailed off as if he had lifted the pen and never returned. I swallowed hard and set the letter aside gently before picking up the stack of documents, which were tax records from the past 10 years. But the dates did not match what my father used to describe during our conversations, and as I flipped through them, I noticed charges and transfers. He would never have authorized small amounts, at first then larger ones, and next to them were handwritten notes in a different handwriting. Not as short phrases like, "adjust this" and "delay filing," and I felt a slow dread creep up my spine because I recognized the handwriting even before I admitted it to myself. With my pulse quickening, I reached for the USB drive, feeling the smooth metal between my fingers, and I walked to the small desk in the corner where his old laptop still sat, plugged into the wall, the screen dark but functional. Once I tapped the keys to bring it to life, and after entering the password my father had always used, I slid the USB into the port and waited while a folder popped open on the screen. Inside were audio files, each labeled by date, and I clicked the earliest one, hearing the muffled static of a phone line before a familiar voice sharpened into clarity. Meredith instructing a bank employee to flag the account under a routine audit, using the casual tone of someone who had done this many times before, someone who believed she had the right to meddle in accounts that were never hers. And as I listened further, my stomach tightened, because she was not just asking for updates, she was directing which statements should be reviewed, which transfers should be monitored, which withdrawals should trigger alerts, like she had been slipping into my father's financial life long before he died. I clicked another file, this one from last year, and her voice sounded even more confident as she said, "He never checks these things anyway. Just make sure I am notified first." And I gripped the arms of the chair so tightly, my fingers ached, because there was something unbearably intimate about hearing her manage his money behind his back. Something so invasive that my chest tightened with a mixture of anger and disbelief. And I let the next file play, and this time she said something that made my breath stop entirely. She told the bank employee to hold any unusual activity because his health is declining and he is not thinking clearly, a sentence she must have rehearsed because it was said so smoothly, so convincingly, and hearing the way she weaponized his age and his trust felt like a blow I was not prepared for. I leaned back in the chair and pressed my palms over my face, trying to steady myself. And as I dragged in a long breath, I noticed something else on the computer screen that I had overlooked. At first, a login attempt from 2 months ago labeled password reset request, which was odd because my father never changed his passwords in all the years I had known him. And when I clicked the details, I saw the timestamp was only 6 days before his hospitalization, meaning that for some reason he had tried to secure something shortly before he died. My throat tightened as I thought about the incomplete letter and the documents and the recordings, and suddenly pieces that had not made sense before began to align in a way that made my stomach turn. I rose from the chair and paced the room, the floor creaking softly beneath me as the weight of everything began to settle. And I whispered into the silence he knew she was doing this, and he tried to stop her. And the realization that he had been fighting a quiet battle alone, while everyone believed Meredith was acting out of concern, made my chest ache in a deeper way than grief, something sharper, something closer to betrayal on his behalf. I returned to the safe and sifted through the remaining documents, noticing withdrawals marked as suspicious in the margins lines my father must have written when he first discovered the discrepancies, and I felt a slow heat building inside me as I pictured Meredith smiling through his funeral, lecturing me about responsibility, pretending to be the only one who cared about protecting the land, while hiding years of manipulation behind that polished voice. I closed the safe with steady hands because I finally understood what the key and the note were meant to lead me toward. Not just proof of her lies, but the truth of how long she had been preparing to take control. And as I locked the study behind me and stepped out into the cooling night air, I felt something shift sharply inside me, something that was no longer just grief or suspicion, but a focused anger mixed with purpose. Because now I had evidence, now I had clarity, and now I knew, without doubt, that everything she had done in the past week was only the final act of a plan she had been crafting for years. One she believed I was too young and too naive to uncover. And as I walked toward my car, I whispered to myself, she's about to learn how wrong she was. Wrong. I drove to my mother's house the next morning with my father's letter, folded tightly in my hand, the edges already soft from how many times I had touched it through the night, because sleep had been impossible after hearing Meredith's voice on those recordings and realizing how deeply she had rooted herself into the cracks of my father's final years. And as I stepped onto the porch, the familiar smell of pine and laundry detergent drifted toward me, comforting in a way that made my chest ache because I needed my mother to believe me. I needed at least one person in this family to look at me and not see the caricature Meredith had painted. But when she opened the door, her eyes already looked guarded, like she had rehearsed something she was determined to say even before I crossed the threshold, and that small shift in her expression made something cold and quiet settle behind my ribs. She asked me to sit at the kitchen table, the same place where my father used to drink his morning coffee, and tease me about forgetting to refill the sugar jar. And as I sat down, she folded her arms the way she did when she had already decided she was disappointed in me. Then she said, in a voice too calm to be natural, that she had spoken with Meredith last night, and that she finally understood why everyone was so worried about me. And I felt the first fracture of fear run through me, because the phrasing was the same one relatives used when they believed a lie they found convenient. I tried to explain what I had found, the safe, the recordings, the forged documents, but she lifted her hand slightly as if silencing a child and said, "Aria, enough. Meredith told me how overwhelmed you have been and how you have been imagining things because of stress. She said you are letting grief cloud your judgment and that you are starting to blame her for things that are not her fault." And I stared at my mother, stunned, because the speed at which she accepted Meredith's version of reality felt like watching the floor tilt beneath my feet. I told her I had real proof evidence that Meredith had been monitoring my father's accounts for years, that she had instructed the bank to restrict information from him, that she was trying to steal the land. But my mother shook her head with a tired sigh and said, "Aria, you are young, and you do not understand how complicated money and responsibility can be. Your aunt has managed things like this before she knows what she is doing." And I felt my throat tighten as she added that I was being selfish by refusing to sign because I was putting the entire family at risk, and that sentence hit me harder than everything Meredith had said in the past week, because hearing it from my mother's mouth felt like betrayal carved into bone. I leaned forward, desperate now, telling her she had to listen, that Dad left me something for a reason, that he wanted me to know the truth. But she only sighed again and said, "Aria, you do not need land worth that much. You are still figuring out your life. Let Meredith handle it before you make things worse." And I felt something inside me crack, because she was not just siding with Meredith, she was handing me over to her like a problem she wanted off her plate. I sat back stunned into silence as she kept speaking, her voice gentle, in the way people sound when they think they are being wise, but are actually being cruel, telling me that I should not cling to property. I could not afford, that I should let adults manage adult matters, and that maybe when I was older I would understand that not everything is about fairness. Sometimes it is about practicality, and hearing her talk about me, like I was incompetent, like I was a child, after everything I had endured, made the room feel suddenly too small. I reached into my pocket and unfolded the unfinished letter from my father, sliding it across the table to her, my hands trembling now, not from fear, but from the crushing weight of helplessness. And I said, "Please read this. Please try to see what he was trying to tell me," but she barely glanced at it before pushing it back toward me gently and saying, "Sweetheart, your father was sick. He was confused near the end. You cannot cling to every half-written thought he left behind," and her dismissal hit me like a blow, because she had erased him in one sentence, erased his warning, erased everything he tried to protect me from. My eyes burned, but I refused to cry in front of her, so I stood slowly, feeling the ground sway beneath me as if I had been struck from behind, and I whispered, "I thought you would believe me. I thought you knew me better than that." But she only looked at me with that same weary pity and said, "Aria, this stubbornness is exactly why the family is worried." And as she spoke those words, the last thread connecting us snapped quietly inside me. I left the house numb, the sound of the door closing behind me feeling like something final, and I walked to my car without looking back, because if I did, I knew the hurt on her face would undo me completely. So I sat behind the wheel and allowed the numbness to wash over me. A stillness so deep it felt like being underwater, unable to hear anything but my own heartbeat echoing faintly. I did not start the engine immediately. Instead, I opened the folder of documents again, gripping them like a lifeline, and as I flipped through them, a page I had missed earlier slipped loose from the stack, falling onto my lap, and when I picked it up, my pulse stuttered because at the top of the page was my father's handwriting, firm and steady, unlike the unfinished letter, and below it was a list of financial accounts and assets I had never heard of. My eyes scanned the page quickly until they landed on a section labeled Beneficiary Update, and beneath it was my name, written clearly unmistakably, not in a faded annotation, but in official typed lettering. And as I read further, my breath caught because the document was dated just 3 months before he died, long before he was confused or sick or anything my mother claimed he was. And there at the bottom was a signature that was unquestionably his. The numbness in my chest shifted, then turning into a low burning heat as the meaning settled over me. He had changed something. He had secured something in my name, and he had done it while fully aware of its importance. And that small fact lit a spark inside me, because it meant that all of this, every betrayal, every dismissal, every lie was unraveling into something much bigger than Meredith had ever intended to reveal. I held the document to my chest, my breath shaking now with a different kind of emotion. Not despair, but the faint stirring of strength returning. Because my father had not abandoned me. He had not doubted me. He had trusted me with something no one else knew about, yet something that meant the truth was no longer slipping out of reach, but rising to the surface where it would be impossible to ignore. And as I finally turned the key in the ignition, I whispered not to my mother or to Meredith, but to my father, "Thank you, I understand now, and I will finish what you started." When Meredith showed up at my door 2 days later with nearly the entire extended family crowded behind her on the porch, the morning air still cold enough to see her breath as she huffed indignantly, I felt a strange calm settle over me, a quiet certainty that had been building steadily since the moment I found my name on that document in my father's safe. And even though my stomach tightened at the sight of so many faces ready to judge me, I kept my expression steady as she announced loudly so the neighbors could hear that she was done waiting and that it was time for me to act like an adult and sign the papers before I destroyed everything my father built. And as she shoved the folder toward me, I noticed several relatives looking at me the way people look at someone cornered expecting them to fold under pressure. She pushed past me into the living room without waiting for an invitation, claiming this is a family matter. "Aria, we are doing what is best for you," and the others filed in behind her, filling the space with whispers and the tense rustling of jackets, and I stood there watching all of them take seats like they had rehearsed this intervention, like they were certain I would break under the weight of their collective disapproval, and Meredith smiled in that thin, triumphant way that told me she believed she had already won. She placed the folder on the coffee table and tapped the top of it with 2 sharp fingers, saying, "Your father would not want this land in your hands. He told me many times that you were not ready," and the lie rolled off her tongue so smoothly that several heads nodded automatically, absorbing it as truth, because it was easier to accept her confidence than question their own ignorance. But after everything I had uncovered, I felt no fear, left only a cold patience, as I watched her maneuver herself into what she thought was her final victory. She opened the folder to the forged document I had seen in her presentation and slid a pen toward me, saying, "Sign here, and the land will be protected under someone who actually knows what they are doing." And I looked at the paper for a long moment, letting the silence stretch just enough for her to feel in control. Then I lifted my gaze to meet hers and said a single word with a steadiness so sharp it cut through every whisper in the room. "No." The room went still, truly still, like the air itself froze in place, and Meredith blinked at me as if she genuinely did not understand the meaning of the word. Then she laughed lightly, the laugh of someone who thinks the other person is simply having a dramatic moment before agreeing, and she said, "Aria, stop being childish, sign the paper now." But I stepped closer to the coffee table and repeated the word in a voice that left no room for misunderstanding. Saying no with a coldness I did not know I possessed until this moment, and Meredith's face shifted, the confident smirk slipping into something tighter, something uneasy. Before she could recover, I reached into my pocket and placed the USB drive on the table. the metal small but heavy in the sudden silence, and I said, "Since we are talking about who is responsible and who is not, I think everyone should hear what you have been doing with my father's accounts." And her hand jerked slightly toward the USB, as if she wanted to snatch it away, but knew she could not without revealing panic, and I watched the first flicker of fear cross her face as I unlocked my phone and pressed play on the recording of her instructing the bank employee to flag my father's account. Her voice filled the room thick with authority she never deserved, and I kept my eyes on her as her complexion paled, as murmurs rippled through the room, as every relative who had judged me began to shift uneasily in their seats. I did not raise my voice or explain anything. I simply let the recording play, letting each sentence unravel her carefully constructed image. And when the audio ended, the silence afterward was heavier than any argument I could have made, and she stared at me with her mouth slightly open as if she were searching for a lie big enough to cover the one I had just exposed. But before she could speak, I closed my phone and said quietly, "This is only a fraction of what I have," and she flinched because she knew it was true. She looked around the room in desperation, expecting someone to rescue her, but the relatives who had followed her so confidently into my home now looked away from her, some confused, some ashamed, and I felt a cold steadiness pass through me as I picked up the USB and slipped it back into my pocket, not revealing the tax records, not revealing the beneficiary document, not revealing how deep my father's trust in me had gone. Because this was not the moment to show everything. This was only the first crack I wanted her to feel before the entire foundation collapsed beneath her. I leaned slightly toward her and said, "You came here to force me to give up what is mine, but the only thing you accomplished today was showing everyone who you really are." And the flicker of panic in her eyes deepened into something closer to dread as she realized she no longer controlled the narrative. Without waiting for her response, I walked to the door and opened it wide, the gesture unmistakable, and said the meeting is over, and the family filed out slowly, casting uncertain glances at Meredith as she sat frozen on my couch, her hands shaking slightly, her carefully crafted authority crumbling in front of everyone who once believed in her. I did not say another word as she finally stood clutching her purse like a shield and walked past me with stiff steps, and only when the porch was empty again did I allow my breath to release in a slow, controlled exhale. But the moment the quiet settled, I knew exactly what I needed to do next, so I went to my desk, opened my laptop, and pulled up the folder of recordings and documents my father had hidden from me. Then I drafted a formal complaint and evidence package for the Coconino County Court, attaching every piece of legally admissible proof and referencing the financial misconduct statutes she had violated. And when the system asked me to select legal representation, I typed the name my father had once spoken with deep respect, a real estate attorney he had quietly helped years ago, a man known for being relentless in court and fiercely loyal to those who had shown him kindness. When I clicked submit and saw the confirmation appear on the screen, I felt the shift in my body the moment the battle stopped being defensive and became something else entirely, because now it was official. Now it was documented. Now it was public record waiting to unfold, and Meredith had no idea that what happened in my living room was nothing compared to what awaited her next. The notice from the Coconino County Court arrived sooner than I expected, and when I opened the envelope at my kitchen counter and read that the judge had approved an open mediation session instead of a closed one, my pulse slowed with a strange sense of inevitability, as if everything was finally aligning the way my father had intended, long before I realized what he had prepared for me. So when the morning of the hearing came, I drove to the courthouse in a steady silence, letting the clean, cold Arizona air settle my nerves as the mountain peaks rose in the distance, like reminders that things older and stronger than Meredith's ambitions existed. And by the time I walked through the courthouse doors, I felt anchored in a way I had never felt in my life. The clerk directed me to a large meeting room where long tables were arranged in a square, and as soon as I stepped inside, I saw Meredith already seated with her posture, stiff and her lips pressed tight, her eyes darting around as if searching for an ally in a room that suddenly felt too public for her carefully managed image. And I noticed the developer representative sitting near the back with his briefcase resting neatly at his feet, clearly uncomfortable to be involved in whatever this had become. My mother arrived a few minutes later, avoiding my eyes as she took a seat on Meredith's side of the table, and several relatives trickled in behind them, whispering nervously, because the moment they realized the session was open to observers, their confidence began to crack, and I simply chose my seat alone across from them, folding my hands quietly in my lap as the judge entered. He was an older man with sharp eyes that scanned the room, like a man who had seen every version of family greed imaginable. And when he began the session, he stated plainly that since property transactions had been attempted before all beneficiaries were notified, the session was being handled under heightened transparency, and Meredith visibly flinched her fingers, twisting the hem of her blouse, like she suddenly understood this was no longer a simple family disagreement, but something with legal teeth. The judge asked Meredith to explain her claims first, and she launched into a desperate ramble about how she had only been trying to protect the land from my irresponsibility, and how my father had confided in her that I was not capable of handling anything of this magnitude, her voice rising and falling with forced conviction. But every sentence sounded thinner than the last as she kept glancing at the judge to gauge whether he believed her, and he did not. When he turned to me and asked whether I had any evidence relevant to the case, I reached slowly into my bag and placed the USB on the table, pushing it forward with 2 fingers, and the air shifted immediately, as if every person in the room remembered the recording from my living room, even though they had not heard it in full. The judge nodded to the clerk who plugged the drive into the laptop connected to the projector and asked me to confirm what file should be played, and I pointed to the one labeled Audio 1, keeping my voice calm as I said it contains instructions regarding my father's account. The moment Meredith heard herself speaking through the speakers, instructing the bank clerk to flag my father's account and refer all notices to her instead of him, the color drained from her face so quickly she had to grip the table to steady herself, and the room filled with a frozen stillness as the recording continued into her mocking laughter about tricking me and her confident assurance that she would make me sign anything she needed because I was too naive to understand what was being taken from me. My mother gasped softly and covered her mouth. The developer shifted in his seat like he was calculating exit strategies, and several relatives stared at Meredith with disbelief as if they were seeing her clearly for the first time. The judge asked me if there was any visual material, and without speaking, I nodded toward the second file the video captured from my father's home office security system, the one he must have activated intentionally before his final weeks, and the moment the footage appeared on screen, showing Meredith rifling through his desk drawers and speaking on speakerphone with someone about accelerating the land transfer while he was hospitalized, her composure cracked completely. Her breath came in sharp gasps, and she whispered, No, this is out of context," but no one looked at her with sympathy now. The judge paused the video and leaned forward, his tone shifting from neutral to deeply concerned as he asked her whether she had ever accessed my father's account without his written consent. And before she could form an answer, he clicked open a document in the folder labeled Bank Log showing a pending transaction initiated under my father's name, using a digital signature timestamped 2 weeks before he died, a signature that financial forensics had already flagged as inconsistent. He turned to her and said, "Mrs. Henderson, unless you can provide evidence that this transaction was authorized, this is considered attempted fraud under state law," and the word fraud landed in the room like a stone dropped into still water, sending shockwaves through every person present. Meredith broke, then truly broke her shoulders, shaking as she pressed both hands to her forehead, tears spilling down her cheeks as she began mumbling excuses about stress and misunderstandings, and how she only wanted what was fair for the family. But the judge held up a hand and silenced her with a single firm question about whether she was aware that using someone else's financial identity, especially while they were incapacitated, is a prosecutable offense. The developer stood abruptly, saying he wanted no involvement in this and that his company had assumed all documentation provided to them was legitimate, distancing himself from her as fast as possible, as he muttered, "We cannot proceed with this acquisition." My mother sat motionless, eyes fixed on the table, guilt spreading across her expression, like a slow realization that she had backed the wrong person for far too long. The judge asked me whether I intended to pursue charges, and I said quietly that I was following my father's instructions and that the evidence spoke for itself, and he nodded solemnly before stating that the mediation was concluded and that the county would begin a formal review of all transactions connected to my father's estate. As he closed the session, relatives avoided looking at Meredith as she sobbed into her hands, and my mother finally lifted her gaze to me with an expression filled with confusion, regret, and something like fear, and I simply pushed in my chair and stood slowly letting the silence carve the truth into the room before I walked toward the exit, knowing that everything had shifted irrevocably and that this was only the beginning of the fall Meredith had built for herself. In the days following the mediation, the fallout unfolded so quickly and so loudly that even I, who had prepared myself for consequences, the moment I submitted the evidence, found myself stunned by how fast Meredith's world collapsed around her, as if someone had cut the supporting beams from beneath a house and simply waited for gravity to do the rest. And the first sign that the damage was irreversible came when I received a voicemail from an IRS investigator who informed me in a measured, professional tone that my father's account logs, along with the flagged transactions shown in court, had triggered an automatic audit, and hearing the words, "federal review," made my breath catch for a moment, because I knew exactly what that would mean for Meredith, who had spent years weaving her financial ambitions through his assets like vines choking a dying tree. And as I ended the call, I felt a heaviness lift from my chest, replaced by a strange, quiet sadness that she had brought this upon herself long before I ever intervened. By the end of the week, neighbors in her subdivision in East Flagstaff were whispering about strange cars parked in front of her house, men in suits carrying folders, her blinds half drawn in the middle of the afternoon, and I heard from a cousin that Meredith had shown up at a family gathering, looking pale and frantic, claiming I had turned everyone against her, even though no one needed my help for that since her own actions were finally visible in a light too bright to distort. Her job as a real estate consultant lasted only 4 more days after the mediation, because the developer who had fled the courthouse wasted no time forwarding clips of the recorded audio to her employer, who promptly suspended her pending investigation and then quietly terminated her contract once the IRS involvement became official. And the swiftness of their decision made it clear she had never inspired loyalty in that environment, either only usefulness, and that usefulness evaporated the instant she became a legal risk. Relatives who once stood behind her in my living room now avoided her calls entirely, and when she tried to rally them by insisting I had manipulated the judge and forged evidence, they responded with stiff silence or excuses about being busy, because nothing is colder than family who realizes you might drag them down with you. And for the first time in my life, I watched the power she had wielded so ruthlessly begin to dissolve under the weight of her own arrogance. My mother appeared at my door one evening just after sunset, standing stiffly on the porch with her hands clasped in front of her like she was preparing for a funeral, and when I opened the door, she swallowed hard before whispering my name in a voice I had not heard since childhood, one that trembled with something like remorse, and she said, "Arya, I think I owe you an apology." But even then she could not meet my eyes, instead staring down at her shoes, as if afraid to see the reflection of her own choices in my face. She told me she had spoken with the investigator who visited her that day, and that hearing the evidence directly from an official, rather than through family gossip, had made her realize how wrong she had been, and she admitted in a halting voice that she had chosen Meredith's certainty, because it was easier than questioning a woman who had dominated the family for so long. And she said, "I should have believed you. I should have asked you before assuming the worst." And although part of me longed for this moment, I also felt the ache of how late it had come, like a bridge repaired only after the river beneath it had already changed course. I stepped back to let her inside, listening quietly as she spoke, and when she finally fell silent, waiting for me to comfort her as I always had, I realized something had shifted permanently inside me, so I told her gently but firmly, "Mom, I did not do any of this to hurt her. She hurt herself with every lie she told and every line she crossed, and I am done cleaning up the messes she makes." And though the words were soft, they made her flinch, because she understood they came from a place she had never expected me to reach, a place where her approval no longer held power over me. In the following week, I tracked Meredith's unraveling from a distance, not because I wished for revenge, but because the consequences had become a kind of inevitability, a slow-moving avalanche she had started years before, when she decided my father's money mattered more than integrity. And when a notice was posted on her front door warning of potential property seizure if she failed to respond to federal inquiries about unexplained withdrawals, the image spread quietly through the family like an unspoken judgment, a reminder that greed always leaves a mark large enough for the world to see. I kept working through those days, arriving at my desk on time, completing surveys, reviewing soil maps, answering emails, and no one at the office mentioned the HR review ever again, because the tone of the messages I forwarded to them from the court was enough to silence every suspicion, and the same supervisor who once warned me that family issues might destroy my career now spoke with a careful respect, as if he sensed there were layers to my life he had never understood. The shift was subtle but unmistakable, and it echoed the quiet transformation happening inside me, as the fear that had once defined so much of my relationship with Meredith slowly loosened its grip, replaced by the certainty that I had stepped into a role my father always knew I would one day claim. That certainty crystallized the morning I opened my email to find a message from an organization whose name I had glimpsed weeks earlier, when the notification flashed briefly across my phone and the subject line made my breath catch as I read the words, "Your board seat is now active." And seeing those words felt like something inside me finally locking into place, because it meant the quiet confidence my father had in me had been more than symbolic. It had been part of a larger plan, one that elevated me into a position no one in my family could ever have imagined for the girl they dismissed as someone who only knew how to look at maps. I stared at the email for a long moment, letting the weight of it settle, realizing that while Meredith's world was disintegrating, mine was expanding, not because I fought her, but because I finally stepped into the space my father had protected for me all along. And as I closed the laptop, I understood with absolute clarity that the next phase of this battle would not just be about defending what was mine, but about shaping the future of the land he entrusted to me, a future Meredith would never again have the power to distort. 3 days after the IRS notice appeared on her door, I heard a hesitant knock on my porch, just after 6 in the evening when the sun was dropping behind the pines in that soft Arizona glow that usually makes the whole street look peaceful, though nothing about the figure standing on my welcome mat resembled peace, because when I opened the door and saw Meredith thinner than I had ever seen her, shoulders caved inward like someone carrying the weight of her own downfall hair, unbrushed, makeup smeared, clutching a stack of crumpled papers to her chest as if they were a shield. The first thing I registered was not triumph, but the unmistakable smell of desperation, sharp and overwhelming. And for one long moment, she simply stared at me as though she barely recognized the person standing in front of her, the niece she had spent years belittling. now someone she had no power over. She tried to speak, but her voice cracked on the first word, so she swallowed and tried again, forcing out Arya. "We need to talk." And I stepped onto the porch, closing the door halfway behind me, because something in her expression made it clear she wasn't stable enough to be welcomed inside, and she glanced at the partially closed door with a flicker of humiliation, as though the gesture alone had confirmed what she feared most, that whatever authority she once held had evaporated completely. She took a shaky breath and began talking rapidly, her words tumbling over each other as she explained that the IRS had frozen one of her accounts and that the county had issued a notice regarding the suspicious pending transaction connected to my father's estate. And she said it all, as though I had not been the one who brought those documents forward in the first place, as if I needed an explanation for consequences she had created long before I ever stepped into a courthouse. And then she whispered the sentence she had clearly rehearsed again and again, Haria. "I need you to withdraw the complaint. If you do, they will ease the review and I can stop the house from being taken." And when she said the word house, her voice cracked entirely because now the threat was no longer theoretical. It was real and imminent and aimed directly at the life she built on top of her deception. For a moment, I simply watched her taking in the trembling fingers gripping the papers, the uneven breaths, the wild fear in her eyes, and it struck me how different she looked from the woman who once stood in my living room, surrounded by relatives she believed she could command. And when she reached out as if to touch my arm for sympathy, I stepped slightly back, not with anger, but with a calm boundary she had never expected me to enforce. She froze, lowering her hand slowly, as though realizing contact was no longer hers to initiate. And when she finally met my eyes, she said, "Please, Arya, I know I made mistakes, but the house is all I have left. If I lose it, I have nowhere to go." Her voice pitched higher with each word, her panic rising like a tide threatening to swallow her whole, and she searched my face for softness, for guilt, for the girl she used to manipulate. Instead, I answered her in a steady, quiet tone that startled even her, saying, "You are not losing your house because of me. You are losing it because of everything you did when you thought no one was watching," and the sentence landed between us like a slow, sinking truth she could no longer run from. She shook her head violently, insisting that she only did what she had to in order to protect the family assets, insisting that my father had trusted her more than me, insisting that this was all a misunderstanding, blown out of proportion by outsiders, and then she whispered something I had not expected to hear, something that made the air shift. I tried to get him to change the will, but he refused, and then he locked me out of his study. And the moment she said it, her eyes widened like she realized she'd said too much, but the damage was done. The truth already hanging between us in a way she could no longer hide. My pulse tightened in my throat because the puzzle piece snapped into place more brutally than I anticipated, remembering the new password on his account. The revised documents dated weeks before his death, the way he stored everything in the safe with my name on it, and while part of me felt grief twist in my chest for what he must have endured in those final months, another part of me felt a deep, quiet fury that Meredith had dared to push him when he was vulnerable, had dared to treat him as an obstacle rather than family. And now here she stood, begging the daughter he trusted instead of the woman he pushed away, begging for the mercy she had never once shown anyone else. She reached out again, voice breaking completely, saying, "Arya, please, I did not think it would go this far. You are young, you have time to rebuild." I do not, and hearing her call me young, as if it disqualified me from the rights my father gave me, made something cold in me snap into absolute clarity. I straightened my posture, letting the calm settle like a steady current through my words, and I told her, "I am not responsible for what you built on stolen trust, and I will not rescue you from the collapse you engineered." And the moment the sentence left my mouth, she collapsed against the porch railing, covering her face with both hands as tears poured down unchecked. The sound of her sobs echoing through the quiet neighborhood like the final unraveling of a woman who had always believed she could outrun consequences. She begged then, switching from pleading to bargaining to blaming in quick panicked spirals. But I did not raise my voice, did not look away, did not offer comfort. I only repeated the truth. She refused to hear that her downfall was not mine to carry, that she had made choice after choice, believing she would never be held accountable, and now she was simply meeting the outcome she created. After several long moments, her sobs slowed, and she lifted her head. Mascara streaked down her cheeks, eyes swollen, and she whispered, "Do you hate me that much?" And I answered softly, "No, I do not hate you at all. That would mean I was still tied to you, but I am finally free of everything you tried to make me believe about myself. And freedom is not something I will surrender because you are scared." She stared at me as though I had spoken a language she had never heard. Then she wiped her nose with the back of her hand and stumbled down the steps without another word, her figure small against the fading light as she moved unsteadily toward the car parked crookedly at the curb. And as she drove away, I felt no satisfaction, only a strange, quiet finality, like watching the last flames of a long, destructive fire extinguish themselves. When I stepped back inside and closed the door, the house felt different, lighter, somehow as though my father's presence lingered in the silence. And as I walked to the kitchen counter, my phone buzzed with an email notification, and when I unlocked it and saw the message at the top of my inbox, my breath stilled for a moment because it came from the board that had approved my membership weeks earlier. And the subject line read, "Confirming confidential disclosure regarding your father's estate documentation," and inside the message was a single sentence that illuminated everything with unmistakable clarity. "Your father informed us months ago that attempts were being made to coerce him into altering his will. We are relieved to see his precautions protected you." And as I read the words, I felt something inside me settle, like a final piece, clicking into place, a truth that reached across every wound Meredith had ever left in me, reminding me that my father had known who I was, even when everyone else dismissed me, and that he had built a path for me long before I learned how to stand on it. In the weeks that followed Meredith's visit, the chaos swirling around her life continued to unravel with a speed that felt almost surreal. Yet inside my own world, a different kind of stillness began settling into place. A quiet forward motion shaped by choices my father had hidden away from me long before I knew I would need them. And it started the morning I finally opened the second envelope from his safe, the one I had avoided because I thought I already understood enough, only to find a set of documents that made my breath slow in disbelief as I realized the estate I had been defending was only part of what he had left behind. The papers described an investment portfolio held under a trust name I had never heard before, a fund created years earlier and fed quietly through land leases, mineral rights, renewable energy contracts, and small but consistent stock acquisitions in industries connected to conservation and resource management. And at the bottom of the page was a number that made me press my palm flat on the table to steady myself, because the fund was worth far more than the land itself, a sum that explained the quiet confidence he carried in his final months when he kept saying that the future would be safer than I realized. I sat in silence as the sunlight crept across the kitchen tile, letting the truth settle over me, understanding that he had built a second foundation beneath the first, a legacy protected from anyone who might try to gut the land for profit. And that foundation was now entirely in my name, transferred automatically the moment the court validated the will he had rewritten, despite Meredith's attempts to corner him. With the trust activated, I met with the attorney my father had once helped, a man who greeted me with a respectful warmth that made me understand why my father trusted him. And together we reviewed the safest path forward for the land, not as a battlefield anymore, but as a living entity. I now held the responsibility to protect, and the more we talked, the more I felt something bloom quietly inside me, something like purpose, steady and grounded in a way fear had never allowed before. Within a month, I finalized a partnership with a regional conservation agency that had long wanted to preserve areas of northern Arizona from overdevelopment, and I used both the original estate assets and the trust my father built to secure long-term protections, ensuring that no developer could touch the land without crossing a wall of legal and environmental safeguards that stretched across decades. And as I signed the last agreement, I felt the weight of generational harm lift from my shoulders, because now the land was no longer vulnerable to greed or manipulation. It was secure in a way Meredith could never undo. Her world, meanwhile, collapsed in ways that even I had not anticipated, because when the IRS completed their preliminary review and froze her accounts pending a full investigation, creditors descended quickly, followed by letters from county tax offices she had been dodging for years. And when her employer officially terminated her contract, citing reputational damage, she lost not only her income, but the credibility she had wielded like a weapon for so long. And in a matter of weeks, the woman who once boasted about controlling family decisions now scrambled to negotiate payment plans she could never meet. I drove past her neighborhood only once, not intentionally, but because the conservation agency required an in-person meeting at a nearby site. And while leaving the area, I saw her standing on her lawn surrounded by cardboard boxes, her face drawn and empty, as two officers posted a final notice on her door. And though a part of me felt the echo of every wound she had inflicted, I also felt a deep, quiet clarity, knowing her collapse had not come from me, but from the accumulated weight of every selfish decision she had made, without expecting consequences. I kept driving, not slowing, not watching for her reaction, because my life had already moved beyond her shadow. And when I reached home, I opened my laptop to finalize the public announcement of something I had been building quietly in the background, something that felt like the truest expression of the legacy my father had imagined for me. Using the trust he created and a portion of the renewable energy proceeds, I established the Brooks Land Scholarship Fund, a foundation dedicated to supporting young women pursuing studies in environmental science, land management, GIS technology, and conservation law fields often dismissed just as my own career had been, by people who never understood their value, and I felt a deep resolve as I created the mission statement describing access empowerment and stewardship, knowing that every dollar I invested into the fund echoed the message my father left in his final letter, that protecting the future requires both courage and knowledge. When the foundation launched, the local paper reached out for an interview, calling the effort impressive for someone my age, but I declined the spotlight and asked them to focus the article on the land and the scholarship recipients, because my father had taught me that real impact does not need applause, it needs longevity, and the land now held both. On the evening the first scholarships were awarded, I walked alone to the ridge overlooking the acreage my father once cleared, with his own hands, the air cool with pine and dust. The horizon stretched wide and quiet, and for the first time since his passing, I felt something like peace settle into my bones. Not the fragile peace of avoidance, but the deep, steady peace that comes from fulfilling what someone you love trusted you to carry. I looked out over the property, feeling the shape of everything that had happened, the betrayal, the humiliation, the fight, the truth rising to the surface, and I realized that the girl Meredith had once dismissed as someone who only knew how to look at maps had become the woman my father always believed she would be, someone who could read land not as a commodity, but as a responsibility. Someone who could see the future clearly, even when others tried to blindfold her with doubt. In the fading evening light, the world around me felt larger, as if the land itself breathed easier now that it was protected, and I whispered into the quiet air that he had been right to trust me, that his faith had not been wasted. And as the wind moved softly through the trees below, I felt him there, not in grief or longing, but in the certainty that this was what he meant when he left me the note saying, "Wait until they show their true faces," because only once the truth was revealed could I step fully into the life he prepared for me, a life rooted not in revenge, but in justice, not in bitterness, but in purpose. And standing there, I understood with absolute clarity that I had finally become the person he always saw in me long before I ever saw her in myself. The evening the final confirmations came through, I walked up toward the highest ridge of the land, the same ridge my father used to call the Overlook, because from there the whole valley unfolded like an open hand, and as the Arizona sun sank low in the sky, painting the horizon in shades of orange and rose and gold, I felt the weight of everything that had happened settle behind me like a long shadow finally fading, and for the first time in months, I allowed myself to breathe without bracing for the next blow. The wind moved softly across the dry grass, carrying the familiar scent of pine and warm dust, and standing there, I looked back over the long path that had brought me to this moment, every insult, every betrayal, every attempt to break me, disguised as family concern, and I realized how much strength had been born from each wound, how much clarity had come from being forced to see people exactly as they were, instead of how I wished they would be. I thought of Meredith and the years she spent convincing everyone she cared about the family, while quietly dismantling it piece by piece to serve her own ambition. And though part of me still felt the echo of anger, a deeper part felt nothing at all, only the stillness that comes after surviving something you were never meant to survive. And I understood finally that her downfall had never been my victory. It had simply been the truth unraveling itself without my interference. My mother had begun visiting again carefully, hesitantly, as though unsure whether she still had a place in the life I rebuilt, and though forgiveness did not come instantly, something inside me softened each time she tried to understand me rather than judge me, and I knew healing would come slowly but honestly, not because I owed it, but because it was the only way to stop carrying the weight of things that were never mine to hold. I turned toward the far edge of the ridge, where the land stretched wide and quiet, and in that silence I felt my father more strongly than I had since he died. Not as grief, not as longing, but as presence. A steady calm in my chest, reminding me that he had always seen this version of me, even when I was too afraid to imagine her, and the realization warmed me like sunlight, even as the evening cooled around me. The land was safe, now protected in ways that could outlast both memory and conflict, and the scholarship fund was alive, already receiving applications from young women who reminded me of myself at 20, determined, underestimated, and hungry for a chance to prove what others refused to see, and knowing that these opportunities would shape futures far beyond my own, made something inside me settle into a certainty deeper than closure. As the last light slipped behind the ridgeline, I whispered a quiet thank you, not to any one person, but to the long, strange path that had forced me to grow, to fight, to rise. And I felt the truth of who I had become settle in my bones, firm and steady, a woman my father had trusted with a legacy that no amount of greed or cruelty could destroy. And standing there in that fading glow, surrounded by the land that had been almost stolen from me, I realized I no longer needed anyone's approval to know my worth, because everything I had endured had carved it into me permanently, and the only thing left was to move forward into a life built not on fear, but on purpose. If you have ever been underestimated by the people who should have protected you, if you have ever been treated like a burden instead of a blessing, I want to hear your story. Tell me, have you ever been dismissed or pushed aside by your own family? And what did it teach you about your strength?